Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. All right, guys, number 9. 3 more to go after this, and then I will go and finish. I think I have 2 more episodes of Alexander the Great, Kings and Generals. Preemptive like here. My name is Connor. Did I say that? Let's do it.
A comet crosses the sky. For 40 days and 40 nights it lingers, growing brighter, longer, then at last fading from view. It's an omen for empire. Its course is the course that all empires take. In Byzantium, sages debate its meaning, but its meaning would soon become all too clear. Hunnish and Bulgar raiders had let loose a storm like never before seen. Their incursions into Scythia Minor and Thrace had grown. City after city was sacked. Twice, Roman generals were defeated in the field, and the horde pushed all the way up to the Anastasian Wall, a bare 40 miles from Constantinople. Crops were left unattended. Massive portions of the population were enslaved. The economy of the nearby provinces was in ruin. Tax revenue had dropped, and the infrastructure would take years to rebuild. But this was only a temporary threat. Barbarians retreat, raids come and go, and though this one was of the likes not seen in decades, it only served as a prelude to the events that would follow. For the real threat was in the south. A border dispute had flared up and become an open conflict amongst client tribes of the Byzantines and the Persians. These two great empires weren't at war, but the ancient world stood on a knife's edge. Justinian had to send somebody to pacify the situation, but Belisarius was still in Italy, and with him were many of the empire's best troops. So he sent a man named Cetus, who had been in the region ever since the First Persian War, where Belisarius had won fame at the Battle of Dara. And at first, all went well for Cetus. He tried to win the people to his side, and it worked. A tribe known to the Romans as the Aspetiani secretly sent envoys to Cetus to plead with him to let them remain free if, on the day of the battle when he went to put down the rebellion, they would abandon their rebel border tribes and join his force. Eagerly he accepted, thinking that this would be a route to a bloodless victory. When the Aspetiani switched sides, it would demoralize the other rebels, and when they saw how great a force they now faced, might even persuade them to come to terms. And so he had his promise inscribed on tablets of clay and sent by messenger to the Aspetiani. Then he readied his army for the battle. But on the way to confront the rebel forces, some of his outriders encountered a small group of Aspetiani and slew nearly all, either not knowing of the bargain that had been made or not understanding just who this group of rebels was. But some of these men escaped and made it back to their tribe. Shortly thereafter, Cetus cornered the rebels and prepared to fight them in the blasted Armenian hills. But the messengers he'd sent had taken other roads, and his army had outpaced them. So no tablets offering peace, and no promises of safe passage ever reached the Aspetiani. Only news of the death of their comrades and their kin. And so
it is so difficult with all of the communication technology we have today to picture a time before it. And it wasn't even that long ago. I mean, when was the telegraph? Wasn't the telegraph the first? And so it's understandable that a lot of this stuff would happen. It's not a surprise.
So the Aspetiani stayed with the rebels, their resolve to fight now insurmountable on account of the betrayal they thought had occurred. The battle was fierce, and it was personal. The rough terrain didn't allow for the elegant movement of armies, but instead split the fight into 1,000 small actions settled by bravery and skill at arms. And in this chaos, Cetus was isolated, and in his isolation he was recognized by the Armenians and struck down. And so Justinian next sent a man named Bozes to deal with the rebel Armenians, and Bozes invited them to treat with him, asking that they send their powerful men to speak about terms. The Armenians were distrustful of the Romans, but there was one among them, a man named John, who knew Bozes and trusted him, and so convinced the rebels that they should ride out and treat with him. But when they arrived, John's son-in-law saw that their meeting point was surrounded by the Roman army, and so begged John to leave. The rest of the group heard John's son-in-law and left. Only John remained. But for reasons that are still not clear, Bozes slew John, and when this became known, John's son-in-law went to Khosrow, the energetic and able king of the Persians, and pleaded that he join the war. And in truth, the war may have already had his hand in it, as ever since Vitiges told him of Belisarius being tied up in the west, he had wanted a reason to attack the Byzantines. And now he had it. The great king marshaled his forces and drove into Byzantine territory. But rather than savage conquest, he had a better plan. After all, sieges were such a terrible waste of men and material. Instead, he would drive his massive force up to a town, pop in with his envoys, and let them know that for the low price of a huge amount of gold, he wouldn't burn anything or loot anybody or kill anyone. And for the most part, the towns agreed to this deal, which seemed like a far better bargain than being sacked after attempting a defense they couldn't possibly sustain. And this method of bargaining freed Khosrow to move north like lightning, collecting from town after town on the way until he reached Antioch. Here, the city decided to resist. Khosrow's force rapidly overwhelmed the defenses, but cleverly, he left one gate to the city open and unguarded. Seeing a chance for escape, the entire Byzantine garrison took off through the exit Khosrow had left them as soon as things started to go south. And here, Khosrow showed he wasn't playing around. He captured all...
I was confused. I thought someone in the city... Okay, he did that. Never mind.
All the city started to go south. And here, Khosrow showed he wasn't playing around. He captured all the citizens, stole all the wealth, and then leveled the place to the ground. At this point, Justinian decided it was time to treat with Khosrow, who asked for thousands of pounds of gold and an annual tribute to go away. But Khosrow wasn't done. Until messengers came back with his gold, he was going to continue his Raid the Byzantines party. But first on his to-do list was to take a lovely swim in the Mediterranean to show just how far the Persian Empire had come, just like the Persian heroes of legend. When he was done with his brief dip, he...
Wait a second, what is... Oh, it's his belly button.
Empire had come, just like the Persian heroes of legend. When he was done with his brief dip, he commenced part 2 of Operation Stick It to Justinian. In the next town he came to, he actually paid for a... 2 of Operation Stick It to...
I'm such a child, I'm sorry.
Heroes of legend. When he was done with his brief dip, he commenced part 2 of Operation Stick It to Justinian. In the next town he came to, he actually paid for a chariot race in the Hippodrome, but stipulated that the green rider had to win, because after all, as we all know, Justinian was a super fan of the blues. After this masterclass in trollsmanship, messengers finally arrived from Justinian, agreeing to the terms. But Khosrow decided, why let a little agreement get in the way of a good extortion?
You mad?
Campaign, and proceeded to do the same thing he'd been doing basically all the way back home. Although, in part 3 of his Stick It to Justinian master plan, when the citizens of Kari came out to offer him money to go away, Khosrow was like, hey, don't sweat it, bros, you're pagans, we're cool, and sent them their money back. Finally, he thought he'd take a shot at capturing Dara along the way, but in the end was repulsed, and settled for, as usual, a bit of cash to keep moving. Oh, and do you remember all of those captives that he took at Antioch? Well, he was never able to sell them back to the Romans, so instead of selling them into slavery, like basically any other ancient ruler would have done, he had a different plan. You see, before razing Antioch to the ground, he'd had his engineers take copious notes on how the city was laid out, and when they got back to Persia, he had them create a new city for the Antiochians, exactly like the old one. And he named it We Antioch Khusrau, or literally, Khosrow's better version of Antioch. Style points. But as hilarious...
That was nice of him. I thought he was going to say like he had him slaughtered or something.
As all of this was from the Persian side of things, for the Romans this exposed many of the weaknesses underlying their mighty empire, weaknesses which caused their allies to begin to doubt. Soon Lazica, the province just south of the Caucasus Mountains, tried to switch...
People are going to get mad at me, but this is what I mean about the Byzantine Empire and why... Look, it's turning into this like thing where it's fun... It's like it's fun to stay in our corners, but just like when did this? Obviously, there were barbarians raiding Rome before the collapse, but it seems like the Byzantine Empire is like, oh my God, over here, oh my God, over here, oh my God, over here, and yeah, the Roman Empire might have been like that too, but not in like a threatening. The end of the Roman Empire way. I might be wrong, guys. I know I'm just learning about this stuff. But it's just the Byzantine Empire. I need to learn more, okay?
Switched to the Persian side, and war was on again. But finally, Belisarius was back. He organized a raid into Persia, and although not a...
Look, I know I'm watching conflicts and
Finally, Belisarius was back. He organized a raid into Persia, and although not a resounding success quite like many of his other endeavors, it was successful enough to force the Persians to withdraw from Lazica for the season. The following year, though, the great king returned. This time, Khosrow was aiming at Jerusalem. He arrayed before him a mighty host, far greater than that he'd rode with before, and began to harry the borders of Palestine. Though Belisarius had done the impossible time and time again, this was probably the end. When he had defied the odds, he'd always found an advantage that he could magnify. Strong walls, more disciplined troops. But now he faced an empire with soldiers hardened by war, well-disciplined, well-equipped, led by energetic and capable men. He faced a force beyond any he could muster. And yet, he resolved to fight, though it would be his life. And so he gathered men to him, all he could rally. This would be a fight like no other, and if he were to die, it would be in service to the empire. If he were to die, it would be with glory. And each day the Persians drew nearer. Each day the horde of the great king moved inexorably closer. Then they stopped, and they withdrew. Some may say that it was because they feared the great name Belisarius, but it was actually because of something much darker.
Plague?
Whispers. A horror on the periphery. A killer of men.
That was a good cliffhanger. Next.
As the great empires battled in the scorched plains of the Middle East, a new threat began to creep its way onto the scene. It was at first a small thing, a local thing. A man in Pelusium
I was right, yes.
dies. But this death served merely as the starting bell, the catalyst for a time of chaos and dread. A darkness reached out from the borders of Egypt and unleashed a horror never before seen on the world. That man in Pelusium had at first felt only a fever, but then a strange fog descended on his mind, accompanied by a swelling of great black pustules on his thigh. Then he began to vomit blood, and his skin began to decay while he still lived. He had the plague. This outbreak in Pelusium is the first recorded instance in world history of the plague. But still, Pelusium was a somewhat isolated place. Sure, rumors began to spread across the empire of a town transformed into a living hell, but at first they were only rumors, horror stories to share at night. But then the plague moved up to Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, and that horror became very real. The great port city of Alexandria fell into chaos. No medicine or prayer could stop the ravages of the disease. People spoke of the end times, of the wrath of God, and people died. Unfortunately, Alexandria was one of the great ports of the ancient world.
It seems like Egypt and, Alexandria and Egypt is like ever since, it was a big, formidable, very powerful empire, back, from the Bronze Age. And then the collapse. Look, I'm still learning, but ever since then, it seems like Egypt is just this kind of. It's just like it doesn't seem like there are these great battles there or anything. And honestly, in AD at all, like it, especially around this time, it just seems like it's a thing that's passed on to whoever wins a war elsewhere around the Mediterranean, and then it's like, all right, we take Egypt. But it never seems like Egypt is this like great formidable place, or Alexandria.
Center of trade, it provided grain to the greatest cities of Eastern Rome, and so from there, from port to port, the Great Plague made its way across the Roman world. In 542, it reached Constantinople. The horrors it inflicted cannot be overstated. 1 in 4 people in the great city died. Like, imagine that. Imagine if 1 out of every 4 people you knew just vanished. Imagine what it does to an economy, to the functions of
basically, like, every family, obviously, it's like every family losing one person. Obviously, like, some families could lose no one, some could lose everyone, but that's a crazy number.
Trade and of state. How does a world run? Imagine what it does to an economy, to the functions of trade and of state. How does a world run when suddenly, for no rhyme or reason, 1/4 of its people are snatched up by the jaws of death? And those left alive had other grimmer duties. Those struck with the plague didn't die in ways that were uniform. They fell victim to different symptoms, sometimes suffering delirium, sometimes falling into a catatonic state. Some men felt such great thirst that they would run outside, wild, and drink from the fountains until they died, their bodies half in and half out of the water.
I love
Those
water.
who slipped into a coma-like state wouldn't die immediately, not if they had somebody to tend to them. They would eat and drink if nourishment was put to their lips, which meant that many of their loved ones lived with the specter of death, caring for those they love as buboes grew and burst. And those who fell into a coma without somebody to care for them, they starved to death without even knowing, bodies sealed in houses with no one to discover them until the stench became too great. It was said that no man was seen on the street unless he was carrying a corpse.
question, and it's a bit I've asked this before, and it's a bit like off-putting. I get it. But do you think, humans are animals like any other species? And so do you think that after a plague, the remaining sort of gene pool in a group of animals, this being people, right? I feel like as long as do you think they were healthier, like genetically afterwards? Because if only the healthiest are gonna survive the plague, right? And so I wonder if that's like nature's way of like culling out the guys. I'm speaking in purely scientific terms, not morality. Okay, I know, but like if it's nature's way of just saying, do you know what I mean? I probably just said that so bad.
Justinian had set up an office to handle the burials when the plague first struck, but no functionary, no office of state could keep up with the tide of death. First they filled the cemeteries, then they dug up all the open land in Constantinople to bury the dead. Then, in the state's final days of dwindling functionality, they had dug mass graves outside the walls. But soon these too were filled. Grave diggers tried to press the bodies down and pack them in. As everything unraveled, people just began to dump the bodies into the sea, which only led to bloated corpses washing up along the
Imagine the effect on your just psyche that has. I'm sure you just get numb. I'm sure that's how you cope with it. You just get numb to everything, and it's just like, yeah.
Sure. They also tried filling boats with corpses and pushing those out into the waves. All along the Mediterranean world, ghostly ships, manned only by the dead, would find their way to the coastline, bringing a cargo of bodies riddled by the plague. Finally, the people of Constantinople took to simply packing the corpses into the guard towers that lined its great wall. When the wind blew, the stench of decay covered the city. The queen of cities was a ghost town. Those the plague didn't kill, it often drove mad with horror or grief. Suicides increased dramatically, and all over the world, reports spread of grim apparitions, plying the waters in brazen boats, or spreading the plague by a touch of their ghostly hand. Whether they were phantoms of men's plague-addled minds, or merely the specters of fear is unknown, but these demonic visions gave men even more reason to keep hiding behind.
I forgive anyone, or, anyone who thinks, like, imagine how scary that would have been, not knowing why you got sick. Just like everything clean, or like you must have thought like certain people are just chosen to die by God or something, or it's a specter, and I'm sure I would have thought the same thing before.
Behind locked doors. And with all of this happening, harvest couldn't be collected, crops rotted in the fields, and famine loomed. And the plague spared neither the old nor the young, holy men or scoundrels, rich or poor. Everyone got the plague. Everyone, including Justinian. The emperor fell into a deep coma. Soon, the buboes appeared on his thigh. Every day the city prayed, but everyone knew the plague's course. It was here that Theodora stepped in. Make no mistake, throughout Justinian's reign, she was working behind the scenes. During the course of his rule, she had worked to find space for both Orthodox and Monophysite Christians in the empire. She had fought for the rights of women, and she had always helped with imperial policy. On top of that, Theodora had also served as a sort of informal spy master for Justinian's regime, uncovering plots and fending off any internal threats to Justinian's power. In fact, she had just recently forced Justinian's ruthless taxman, John the Cappadocian, into exile as a priest as punishment for his willingness to entertain a plot against the emperor. And here, now in this critical juncture, as Justinian lay comatose, Theodora took up the fallen reins of power. And this is a remarkable thing. To think that she could do this, that she could hold all of the jackals and potential usurpers at bay. All around, there were generals with armies at their call. The empire itself was in a state of disarray. Any one of these generals could easily claim that the current regime had been forsaken by God, that the emperor had no clear heir, and by all accounts, he was weeks from death at most. At no point since Nika was control of the empire more tenuous. Nika! When you consider the fact that Rome, even Eastern Rome, had so often suffered civil wars and rebellions, it's incredible that in the midst of this plague and conflict, armies of Romans didn't array themselves against each other, spilling Roman blood to elevate some other ambitious man.
How do you get mad at me? for saying the stuff about Justinian when everything I've watched from different channels, so it's not that like extra history as a bias against him. Why is it that every video I watch about Justinian, every accomplishment is done by someone else? Like, that's not my fault. That it's what I've seen, and obviously I can't tell you how many times I'm told this, and it's like a running thing on the Discord, and I get it. But every accomplishment is done either because of Theodora or Belisarius, it seems. And I'm not apologizing for that, because that's what my eyes have seen in these videos. Why are they making me think this way?
Man to the purple. But Theodora served...
Like, I've never had a historical figure that you guys in the comments praise so much, and like, I don't know what I'm talking about, and you haven't learned this. And at the same time, every video I watch just like confirming what I thought. All right, so don't.
As a unifying thread, as a continuation of Imperium. She made all the decisions that would normally come to Justinian. She held the court together and acted as a symbol of perseverance for a city and a nation going through unimaginable suffering. But most of all, she acted quickly and ruthlessly, bringing to heel anyone she suspected might attempt to supplant Justinian. She had men of power arrested, she had generals recalled from their armies, and she had her courtiers listen for any sign of sedition. And through doing so, she prevented the civil war that should have come. But one of the men she'd had to recall was Belisarius. The world knew of his promise to never seek the purple while Justinian lived, but Justinian was on his deathbed. Many naturally assumed that Belisarius would simply take on the mantle of emperor once Justinian passed. And though he had tried to quiet those rumors, numerous Roman factions had started to campaign for pushing out the existing imperial family and installing Belisarius instead. And thus, Theodora recalled him, tried him, and confiscated the vast wealth he had accumulated during his campaigns. She would later use her friendship with Belisarius' wife as an excuse to restore him to favor, but for now he was stuck cooling his heels in Constantinople, and safely removed from the power struggle, but also from the battlefield. Luckily for the Byzantines, this plague had struck the Persians as well. The war...
One of the most crazy things I've learned about history is how throughout all of history, communication has been so difficult, which means that quelling rumors is difficult, which means that certain people, scheming behind your back can both be more unnoticeable and yet harder to cover up. And the instant communication is such a game changer. And
war was by no means over, but there was a lull as each of the great empires struggled with their own internal problems and tried to keep their expensively trained troops away from the plague rather than fighting in the field. And so, for weeks, Constantinople existed in torpor, stunned and reeling from the catastrophe that had befallen it. But then, the impossible happened. Justinian woke up.
Isn't that like what happened to Caligula or Nero? One of the two got really sick, but one of them, in Nero's case, like they had been like praying in the Senate or like asking God to like take my life instead or something like that, and then when they found out he was better, Justinian Caligula or Nero, I forget who it was. I think it was Caligula. Asked those people, "Oh, so I heard you were very adamant about me surviving and everything, and that like you would give God your life or whatever." And he's like, "All right, so do it." And so these guys coming to think they've been so loyal and are going to be rewarded are just like, "Okay, well, you said you'd switch lives with me, so here's a dagger." I don't know why I said that. Off topic. I'll finish the last 2 episodes next time, guys. All right, probably tomorrow, or maybe today. There's 2 more. Yeah, if you can answer any of my questions or leave comments, recommendations, suggestions, whatnot, join the Discord, guys. Love to have you. Bye, guys.